Okay, so I was, I wanted to try to figure out what I want to talk to you guys about, and a lot of the work that we do is in what feels like very conventional um, NLP on top of document collections. But today I want to talk about two special kinds of documents and document collections. And let me take a step back before I go forwards. So really the context for all this is that there is simply so much data out there. Right now there are, this graph stops at 2016. There are about 100 billion messages per day. Now messages
I
aren't,
apologize, Gideon, for interrupting you. I actually can't see your screen if you're sharing it.
oh, am I not sharing?
Yeah, I don't see it on the screen.
Oh, okay, sorry, thank you. There we go.
Okay, now we got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, great. Let's see. So, in 2016, there are about 100 billion messages per day. And these aren't just documents. These are also ticks and stock updates, although all the kind of, data information that you expect, out of which, maybe there are 1 to 2 million news stories today generated from about 125,000 different sources. But this, the pace of information is exponential and increasing. And so this is kind of the backdrop for everything that I'm going to talk about. So typically, when you think about extraction in a financial context, the first level is extraction from natural language text. So this is a little text snippet. And you can imagine some of the first things you might want to do is named entity extraction. So here you pick up Apple and Tim Cook. And then, this is just the recognition note, saying that those lexical items are named entities. But then there is then there's the next step of linking those entities to their reference. So in this case, Apple linked to the company Apple, and Tim Cook, the lexical items linked to the referent Tim Cook. And then finally, here's a new relationship that is mentioned by the text snippet. And this is that, there is a new CEO of relationship, a succession event that is said in this piece of text. And so you can imagine that, one of the most trivial ways you would use this is that, if you have a database of CEOs, this would indicate something needs to be updated. And this process at Bloomberg isn't a wholly automatic process, but a lot of parts, many of the pieces are automated, and then there is some human review. So kind of at a very deep level, fact extraction, entity extraction, relationship extraction is very core to our business. Of course, in a financial context, there are new challenges that you don't see in other parts of the NLP space. So this is JP Morgan Chase and Company, and this is the set of acquisitions that resulted in the entity that as it now exists. And you can see these set of acquisitions started in the 1800s. And most recently, one of the notable recent acquisitions was of Bear Stearns, which is acquired in 2008 around the financial crisis. So this is important and relevant in an NLP context because you have to know what the time of the document is you're extracting from in order to find the right referent for the named entity that you've recognized. So if you're looking at a document and it's in 2006 and you see the lexical unit Bear Stearns, okay, well that refers to the entity Bear Stearns. If you see a document in 2010, it refers to Bear Stearns. Now, actually, that should be linked to JP Morgan and Chase and Company. So this kind of point in time nature calls both for new databases in order to organize all the information, and then also for new NLP algorithms that can, reason about what the time of the document is and appropriately probably do the resolution. Of course, there's also a very large inventory of companies and entities that you want to resolve. So, I think altogether, at the time we put together this deck, which was a little while ago, there were about 4 million different organizations, about 3 million different people that our recognizers were able to detect. So, natural language text is really not the only place that information comes in, and a lot of it actually comes in from natural documents. So natural documents are documents that were created by people. So they're not synthetic documents. They're not structured documents. They don't necessarily have an XML structure, but that they have some kind of structure around them. Typically, they're created in some kind of formatting program. And this is a natural document with a table. Tables are incredibly boring, which of course means that I'm drawn to them. And so this is a financial statement. I think it's an annual report from Starbucks, where they have, the total net revenue for one particular year. And you can see that that revenue is extracted and then landed in a database. And that's on the right. This is the beautiful amber on black, which is the Bloomberg colors. And so by landing it into the database, you start to be able to do a lot of things with it. You can plot it, you can compare it to, both back in time for the same company and to other companies, now that it has a structure. And so this isn't natural language text exactly, but these are natural documents which have a mix of text and structure. Okay, well, what do you want to do after you have kind of pulled out these facts? Well, one thing you might want to do is you might want to write a story about it, an automated story. So here we have a automated news story, which was written from a Census Bureau report. So the Census Bureau report showed that, here I'm reading it, limited service eating places, their nominal retail sales fell 0.1% in November. And that story was written, I guess it's somewhere in the middle of January 2018. And then at the end of the month, Starbucks took a dive. But this automated story was written as soon as the report came out to say, oh, okay, well, this certainly is going to impact Starbucks because Starbucks is one of those limited service eating places. And so, this is a way of getting not just these pieces of data out, but putting them in context and putting them in front of people that need to know this information. Another thing that you might want to do is you might be interested in Starbucks. You want to understand what's happening. And so you might want to generate some text right away. And so here there's a beautiful little yellow speedometer. I don't know if you can see it. It's a little bit hard to pick out on the screen. It's right above SBUX US equity. It's a little yellow block. If you click on that block, it will generate this story, which will say, what is S&P's performance today? And these stories are, by and large, Mad Lib kinds of stories, though there's a considerable amount of logic embedded in the story in order to make sure that it's felicitous and pleasant and the information ordering is correct. So it's not strictly a template filling, but it's also not generated de novo. Another thing you might want to do with natural language text is you might want to use it to extract a signal. And so this is Tesla. I guess, if I was going to use a more recent example, I might have chosen GameStop, but this is, Tesla for a period of time in February of 2017. And this is on the top, the blue bars demonstrate the number of tweets about Tesla, and the shaded area with the gray line is the last price, the price of Tesla at the end of the day. On the bottom is a Twitter sentiment. So green is tweets with positive sentiment, red is tweets with negative sentiment. And you can see they're tabulated on an intraday basis and plotted. And so this signal, you might want to use this positive and negative sentiment signal, you might want to use in various different ways, either as input to your decision making. Maybe you want to construct a factor to use in a factor model to directly trade off of it. But this is another thing that people often want to do from text. And this isn't, fact extraction or relationship extraction, maybe in the typical sense. But it's certainly, these are certainly knowledge that you want to discover from text and then use it in a structured fashion. Okay, so this is kind of a larger context, but I want to move and talk about, deep information needs. And, everything so far, with maybe the exception of natural documents, have been thinking about, documents which don't have a huge amount of structure in them. And so I want to talk about three different kinds of kinds of documents and different ways of extracting from them. So first is two different kinds of dialogues, earnings calls, and what is affectionately known as instant Bloomberg or IB, and news flow. And these are all interesting because they begin to push the boundaries of what the scope of domain that you have to reason over is in order to get high performance over your system. And it also shows really how far NLP has come. It's not just fact extraction on a snippet that's meaningful anymore. Now it's really reasoning over much larger chunks. So let me start with earnings calls. And I guess I should mention, clearly all of this work is done, with large teams, but, these next pieces of work, I'm going to present some research work that has come out of the team that I wasn't involved in, and supported only by being on the sidelines and cheering. But I want to share it with you, and hopefully you can see the citations at the bottom and reach out to them if you have very detailed questions. Presumably I won't really be able to answer in detail. So earnings calls. So this is a Tesla earning call back in 2018. Sanford Bernstein's Tony Sacconaghi asked, and so where specifically will you be in terms of capital requirements? To which Elon Musk famously replied, excuse me, next. Boring bonehead questions are not cool, next. And so, that seemed like a reasonable answer for Musk, but the community of analysts and Wall Street in general did not take so kindly. Actually, this is unfortunate. Is there a different orientation? I want to see if I can. There we are. So you can see that after Tesla reported the first quarter results, the market dropped almost right away. So, okay, clearly this wasn't exactly a bonehead question. So what are earnings calls? Earnings calls are interesting. They're complex, naturally occurring structured discourses. Typically what happens is, the company representative, the CEO, goes and talks and reads some prepared remarks. And then you get into some interesting bit at the end where analysts who are on the call ask questions of the CEO. This is an example of a conversation between Brian Novak and Sundar Pichai, who's CEO of Alphabet. And so you can see that there are a lot of things which are happening in this discourse, which are interesting from an NLP perspective. There are a bunch of discourse markers and kind of pragmatic or social kinds of things. There are a number of entities that are discussed. There are various temporal cues. And there are also multiple questions in a single turn. So this is not really a simple discourse, but actually quite a complicated one. And this is work that Catherine Keith and Amanda Stent published in ACL in 2019. Okay, so the research question that they looked at was, can you compare the analysts before and after the call? So before the call, the analysts coming in, and maybe they're on the call, maybe they're not on the call, have a recommendation for the company. Is it bullish? And then they also have and a buy, or is it bearish and a sell? And they also have a price target. And then after the call, they also have a recommendation, which may or may not be the same. Maybe they've moved from a buy to a hold, and maybe they've increased their price target. And so what Keith and Stent wanted to look at was, how are these changes related to the meat of what happens on the earnings call? And so in order to look at that, they collected really quite a volume of earnings calls. You can see that, altogether, there are a little more than 10,000 earnings calls with about 10 analysts on average per call. They subsequently did a fair amount of pre-processing. The part that I want to focus on a little bit is the analyst recommendations. So before, we break analyst recommendations into a 5-point scale. They bucketed that into a 3-point scale: bearish, neutral, and bullish. And they also bucketed the analyst price targets. And so they looked at the percent change in analyst target from the last price target within 3 months of the earning call to the next target that's 2 weeks after the earnings call, presumably to look at, what likely would have changed because of the earnings call. Way far after the earnings call, that's kind of immaterial. And if it's way far before the earnings call, then there could have been lots of other things that were changed as a result of the earnings call. And they also bucketized, discretized that. So then they took and they looked at a fair number of what they called pragmatic features. And so these are named entity, sentiment, hedging features, various other lexicon-based features. And kind of what's interesting here is that these go beyond simple lexical features, but also start to look at properties of the dialogue itself, the turn order, the turn length, whether the how much hedging there is. And that maybe that's a semantic feature, maybe that's a pragmatic feature, but there are a lot of other kind of very detailed aspects of the dialogue that they tried to account for. So the first kind of finding, which is has been suggested before, and you might kind of imagine, is that bullish analysts tend to be called on earlier in the call, and bearish and neutral analysts tend to be called on later in the call. So just coming into the earnings call, if you're you can imagine a just so story, which kind of justifies this. Coming into the call, you're a CEO, your first instinct is to call on someone who you think is friendly. And so you're going to call on a bullish analyst. And then, correspondingly, you imagine it's not surprising that bullish analysts tend to ask more positive questions and less negative ones, and that the reverse is true for neutral and bearish analysts. One of the other aspects that they discovered, which is really quite interesting, though, is that bullish analysts are slightly more concrete about in their questions and tend to ask more questions about organizations and people, whereas bearish and neutral analysts tend to talk about the past more. And you can imagine various different reasons why analysts kind of are geared in this direction. Maybe it's bullish analysts are excited and thinking about the future and want to kind of know the concrete details, or alternatively that bearish and neutral analysts are looking to punish the company in some way and kind of degrade them, and they're looking for talking about things that the company has concretely done in the past that they can point to justify their negative rating. Okay, and so the next piece is what information is predictive of post-call analyst decisions. So, is it the text of earnings calls? Is it market-based features, which, what is the stock price? What are the, pragmatic features that I discussed, or kind of very broad-based semantic features, more representative? What's the relationship between the question answering portion and the presentation portion? Presentation portion, if you remember, is kind of written in advance. And does a term-based model of the call provide more signal than a single document representation? So this is just a description of the features. The market features are, what is the price, the volatility, various, PE ratio, financial analytics. Semantic is very broad-based lexical features, the modern style document embeddings. And pragmatic is individual, data about individual turns. And so I'm not going to go through too carefully the experimental results. Again, I refer you to the paper, but I want to call out that by and large, the semantic features, the bag of words features, and the document embedding features were very high performant, higher performant than kind of the market features alone, and that they also, but the pragmatic features by themselves really didn't perform. And so there's kind of some notion in which, the semantic features have such a wide coverage that they're able to be very performant. And then, the other piece is that, certainly there's something happening in the earnings calls that is causing analysts to make decisions, and that there's some predictive value of the text over the market-based features. So they still had a kind of a little ways to go to kind of tease out the analyst roles and utterances in the middle of call to justify doing that level of analysis, but just to say that, okay, there's something happening in this text which is very meaningful. Okay, switching gears. The next kind of dialogue I want to talk about is, again, affectionately instant Bloomberg. Instant Bloomberg is kind of the name for the Bloomberg chat. There are over 300,000 active users and tens of millions of utterances per day. And you kind of might be very naturally wondering, what are all those people talking about? And so the answer is that, while stocks are traded over exchanges, commodities, FX, and corporate bonds and bonds are typically traded over the counter, which is to say either, not physically even pre-COVID, but either by phone, by email, or really a lot through instant message. And Instant Bloomberg is the platform. And what's interesting from a NLP perspective is that these dialogues are very rich. They have a lot of pieces going on, and there's a lot of ways that you can extract very deep levels of information from these dialogues. And so I'm going to go through a little bit of what the system that the team built for Instant Bloomberg, and this is work from a large team that they presented at SIGIR. I guess it's almost 2 years ago. Ozan Ersoy is the primary author, but there was quite a large team working on it. So on one level, on the dialogue, it comes in as a structured piece where each participant is identified, and their utterances are timestamped. And so the first level of analysis you want to do, of course, is a very straightforward named entity recognition level. The next is dialogue act. So, John is saying, "Good morning, where are you in IBM 25? Presumably that's the IBM corporate bond. Jane gives an offer, Mary and Bob then have this side conversation. And then John responds by saying, okay, I refuse, I have to pass on that. And so each of these utterances have a place in a dialogue. And what's interesting about Instant Bloomberg is there are many, many, many conversations which are negotiations about price and about objects. And so there really is a lot of opportunity to categorize these dialogue acts into a very small set of actions. The final piece is there is a structure that's underlying these utterances, which is a threading structure. So in this example, there are really two parallel conversations happening. One is between John and Jane, and the other is between Mary and Bob. And in order to really understand this entire dialogue, not only do you need to know the securities being mentioned and the dialogue act, you really have to know this conversational threading. And once you have that, there really is a lot you can do with these dialogues. And so over the next bunch of slides, I'm going to discuss very briefly models for each of these pieces. So here is a typical chat. And so this is, slightly less scrutable, than a normal chat, but this is a offer or a description of a particular security. So F is, a identifier for the Ford Motor Company. It's the stock ticker. And then you can imagine this next piece. Well, actually, that's a coupon. Then this is the maturity. This is the month, year of the maturity. This is a spread, presumably over a recognized benchmark. And then this is this size. And so this is this kind of what would appear to us as, as non-bond traders, as maybe gobbledygook, is very information dense and very efficient way for bond traders to communicate. And you can imagine that, this is one asset class, but across different asset class and even to some degree different desks, the vernaculars and the idioms that people use to communicate pricing is actually quite different. So there's a fair amount of work in building the named entity or the information extraction engines to extract all this data, all this structured representation from all these chat instances. I'm not going to say much more about that. There we go. What I want to talk a little bit more about is the dialogue act modeling. Okay. Typically, when people are thinking about information extraction, you don't think about dialogue act as something to extract. That's usually a property that is kind of at least when I was doing my PhD work, seemed very far from something concrete. But in this context, knowing these dialogue acts is very material to understanding how to do this fact extraction. So there's a fair amount of existing work on dialogue act classification, both for what I guess are now called classical models, SVMs, HMMs, MaxEnt models, and kind of the more modern hierarchical neural networks. The team built a new model, which is a bi-LSTM on the utterance level and a DAG-LSTM on the dialogue act level. And you can imagine that there are good reasons for each of these. The utterances have a huge amount of lexical structure inside of them, but you also want to make sure that the conditioning structure on the dialogue acts is very topical and is able to have access to that, and that the constraints are actually fairly large on the dialogue act side, so that you can't have a refusal as the first as the first dialogue act in a conversation. It just doesn't make sense. What are you refusing? It's very hostile, even for Wall Street. And so typically you'd want to start with an offer, and then maybe there's a refusal, and then or maybe there's an acceptance, and the dialogue continues. And so we've built a system internally, but in order to kind of publish results, we used a publicly available corpus, which is the Settlers of Catan dialogue corpus. And in this data, there are about 41 games, 11,000 utterances, 5 dialogue acts. And pleasingly, I guess you can imagine that the conversations on Settlers of Catan are actually fairly similar to the conversations in a financial context, whereas instead of it's what's your price for this particular bond, it's do you want to trade a wood for a weed? And so they built a number of machine learning systems on top of this, and the bi-LSTM with the DAG-LSTM for the conversational, the dialogue acts, achieve the highest accuracy. And so this was a nice example of building in this combined system. Okay, but this isn't the full model. There's also a conversational threading aspect. And here it's, making sure that, you have all of the pieces of the dialogue are connected, and kind of the interstitial pieces are thrown out. And so previously, when people have approached this work, they've looked at it from either a clustering or a dependency parsing framework. Clustering, where you kind of connect all of the utterances together. Dependency parsing, where you take each utterance and you have it point to the previous utterance, which it is in response to. And so in order to evaluate which of these approaches was useful, the team did a pilot study. They collected a set of annotations with consented users, collected statistics over these conversations, and labeled them. And what they found is that the number of people on non-singleton threads, so more than one utterance, that there were 25% of threads had only one person, 65% had 2, and 8% had 3. So really, most of the conversations were between 1 and maybe 2 people. Most of the conversations were between 2 people. And then the other piece is that there was very little interleaving. So 98.5% of all posts started a new thread or is the same as the last thread. And so this you can imagine, gives rise very naturally to a different algorithm. And this is really just a thread change detection. So as you're going through, you say, oh, okay, is this thread continuing the last one, or is it starting a new thread? And it's a sequence labeling where now you have 2 labels. And then after, which is same or different. And then post hoc, you then merge into these contiguous blocks and assign thread IDs. Now, the model that the team used to build this was a multitask learning model, where it was the DAG-LSTM, bi-LSTM, DAG-LSTM in the previous example, but now there is another output, which is this thread change output. So whether this utterance begins a new thread or continues the previous one. And the loss function was the sum of the cross entropy losses. And so for this set of data, the bi-LSTM plus the DAG-LSTM achieved 90% accuracy on this conversational thread detangling. Now, this performance, you can see that the performance isn't perfect for each of these, but even with the level of accuracy as it is, you start to be able to get very interesting high level of information. And so now you're able to do things, for example, like look at, if you're a large sell side, you could look at the performance of your traders. How often are your prices refused? How quickly did it take for your sales traders to respond to an inquiry? How often were you accepted? What was and now that you have these dialogues, you can also ask how far were your prices from what the original offer was, or how at what point did they trade? And so without each of these levels of understanding, the securities, entities, the dialogue acts, and the conversational thread, it's not possible to get this level of information. Once you have all of these pieces, then you can start to get out the efficiency of your sales trading system. There are also opportunities to begin to automate various pieces once you have all of this markup done. Okay, so this is the ending of the part around Instant Bloomberg, IB, and I want to switch to news flow. So if you recall, there are about 1 to 2 million stories that come across the terminal every day. And if you do a search for Amazon, this is, I don't know what year this is, it's a little bit old. You can see just for 2 hours, all of the stories that are tagged with Amazon, they're really quite a number. They're 20 in about 2 hours. So if you are covering Amazon, there is a huge amount of data, a huge amount of evolving news stories that you have to keep up with. So how are you going to do that? Well, are you going to read all these stories? Well, it's not feasible for you to do that. Probably what you're going to do is you're going to scan the headlines, you're going to pick around and find some stories that seem interesting. But even that process is a little clumsy. So the last section, I want to talk about a system that we deployed, I want to say this maybe a year or two ago, that aids users in understanding very quickly the topics for for any particular query. So this is the NSTM, or the Key News Theme project. And so here there's a search box, and you can type your query. Now, this is an example for Amazon, but you can actually type an arbitrary query to collect a set of documents. And then those documents are clustered. And then there's a summary, an extractive summary that's written. And I'll go into all these details later. And then this is presented to the user. And this is a huge, and then there are also the related stories that are put in each cluster. So these are all stories kind of in support of that summarized headline. And so now as a user, you can go in and you can say, okay, well, what is the information around Amazon for any given time period? And you can get this kind of useful clustering and summarization out of it. And so, the design goals here are that it has to be flexible to the query. It's not just a set of pre-canned queries. You have to cluster the related news stories. You have to extract a summary for each cluster. You have to determine the key stories for each cluster. You have to rank the clusters. And also you have to be quite fast and responsive. And I should mention that, again, this was a demo that appeared in ACL of last year. Josh Bamberg is lead author, but again, there were a lot of people involved. And so the architecture at a very high level is there's a real-time ingest. The stories are then indexed. They're put into a search index. They're put into an index. And actually, as they are ingested, there is a online clustering to merge duplicates and near duplicates. And then when there's a new query, the cluster, the set of documents are returned from the search index. They're clustered again with high performance. They're summarized, ranked, stored in the cache, and then also returned to the user. And so, you know, each of these clusters, after the clustering has been done, there is a surface textual summary. The key stories are selected, and then the themes are ranked. And there are various levels of key story selection and ranking, but they rely actually a lot on the story importance metrics that we've built for other purposes. Let me spend a little bit of time on textual summaries, because it's one of the areas that there simply have been a tremendous number of gains in the literature over the past bunch of years, and the performance has been actually pretty surprising to me. So the team looked at two different approaches. One was a OpenIE kind of approach, and the other was a neural network BERT-based sentence compression pipeline. So in the OpenIE pipeline, for each of the stories, there's a dependency parser followed by a predicate argument extraction. There's some pruning, and then there's a surface form realization. On the BERT-based sentence compression model, there is a summarizer that goes through, takes sentences, chooses tokens to keep or retain, drops the tokens that are selected to be dropped, stitches them back together, and then does a little bit post-processing to clean up punctuation, capitalization. Out of this, then there are a large number of ranked sentences from which then the ranker chooses from. And that's how the sentences are created. We've also looked recently at ways of doing summarization to be brief, fluent, and to have high coverage that uses a reinforcement learning, reinforced style summarization technique, optimization technique in order to provide these summarization. And we're still, I think, really heavily exploring summarization as a method for understanding large news flows. Okay, so those were the three applications I want to talk about, and let me just kind of reiterate kind of what I covered. So the theme for all these three applications, it was moving beyond isolated sentences to whole documents, knowledge discovery from whole documents. In the first case, it was looking at earnings calls and starting to poke at the dialogue structure in order to extract insight from text. The second was instant Bloomberg chat, which actually did whole conversation modeling to create a structured representation, which is then used to create analytic derivatives. And then finally, in news themes, the NSTM project used summarization and clustering to enable quick scans of arbitrary text collections. So that is the summary of the talk. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. Thank you for the great keynote. We have time for maybe 2 to 3 questions. I want to remind the audience there's a few different ways to ask questions. If you're logged into the AAAI virtual website, you can go to our workshops homepage via the schedule page and post your question on the Rocket Chat. If you're here on Zoom, you can type it into the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question over audio. But do remember to unmute yourself because I put the audience on mute. Any questions on the line?
Hey, Gideon, great talk. I have a quick question on your Bloomberg chat workflow. Actually, a couple of related questions. The first one is, because disambiguation is very, very difficult, considering that you have very, very short pieces of text, would it make sense to, or would it be possible to incorporate external information, for example, some news that's kind of trending in the day in order to identify what is being talked about, or even things like time of the day. If someone says pizza and it's the afternoon, they don't necessarily mean a Pizza Hut, but probably they're just talking about the food pizza and so on. And the second question is, in the Bloomberg chat, you mentioned that you kind of annotated the data in order to do the evaluations. And we all know that annotations are expensive. So how do you see data augmentation and self-supervision actually being incorporated into such models without having to do expensive annotations?
Okay, those are two great questions. Let me do, I guess, them in order. So if you consider that most of the things that are discussed are requests for prices or requests for quotes, the most relevant information is what the asset is currently trading at. And so you can say, oh, wait a minute, is that a reasonable price for what I believe that object is? If it's not a reasonable price, then probably your disambiguation has gone wrong. So I would say that's the bulk of the external information. We leverage that highly. For your second question, it's interesting, in the context of image recognition, all the data augmentation stuff is very straightforward. And just has really been very surprising in terms of how well it works. I don't know. It's interesting to think about what that would look like for instant message chats. I think it's hard. At some point, I think it's going to be, you need some level of annotation just to make sure that you're mapping into the right, at some point you have to make a decision, how is this item mapping into the database, even if it's as light as saying, oh, look, we have a database. But I wonder, I don't know how much time we've spent on, thinking of like, various zombie dialogues. It's interesting.
Thank you. Maybe one more question. Anyone on the line? Okay, maybe I'll ask that question. So it's quite fascinating. Pretty much everything you've worked on, I've had some painful experiences with in the past. So I learned a lot. It was very interesting to me. One thing I worked on at some point was about identifying streams of news, but it was in the context of potential financial risk to certain stakeholders. And when it comes to financial risk, you're immediately thinking about novelty from a very different perspective, right? Novelty for a general news stream can be any new event. But if you're covering, say, geopolitical risk for a given company, then if a bomb goes off in a location that is already entangled in war, that's not really a novel event. That's something that's relatively expected versus if it goes off in New York City. So I'm wondering if you've had some experience with that, and how do you see that this rich semantic representations helping us profile things like novelty and thematic analysis and so on?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So, Tom, we had a lot of debates about how is it even possible for an algorithm to rank novelty, presumably because it hasn't seen anything else. And you can imagine some various statistics. And Tom Secunda, one of the founders, used to always argue. He'd be like, "Well, if there really was a story about an alien landing in Times Square, presumably none of those words have ever happened before. How would you know that that was a new story?" And I think, part of the answer, I think, has got to be, to your comment about flexible semantic representations, the OpenAI work that gives up these summaries, which isn't exactly landing something in a knowledge base, but just kind of positioning it as a new event. But I think, which is interesting. But I think the other part is really, at the end of the day, the new things and the new material things are really people things. And those, that's a lot of the reason that, Bloomberg has, thousands of reporters that are constantly thinking and exploring the new area and the new frontier. And so I kind of, there's some things that machines are great at, and there's some things that really people are better at. And so I think when it comes to like truly, truly novel things, for a while, I think that's going to be the domain of people.
Makes sense. Thank you so much. This was really fantastic, fascinating talk.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.